front of the camera makes me upset. Fix that and then like, right, you put the video out. Yep. Here we are, ChatGPT. Let's get it going. Hi, I'm Lori, the creator of Muffs Merino. Here we focus on bringing color to life with fewer formulas and more freedom to explore your creativity. Absolutely not. I summarize what I do here. Not listening to instructions, not believing instructions, not trusting the instructions. And because I've done everything the hard way, I think I feel angry that somebody else would have to go through what I went through. I just want to cut all those struggles. Like, I just want to take them out and say, hey, you can still do all this stuff. You know, on Instagram, on all socials, Facebook, I started a Facebook group so we can share results and experiments, diversity colorways, which I send out free every month in my newsletter. I share my dyeing process. What else? I'm Lori from Muffs Merino. I'm Lori from Muffs Merino. Well, I also wanted to develop colors that people would probably buy if I were to open a yarn shop. Straight to Drops Yarn website, they know what sells. I was inspired by their colors. It took me so long to make it and refine the colors. Now on to, my cat got bored and she left. Catch and release. Catch and release. She won't get the bird. Oh, it's already left. It's already left. She doesn't even run for it. Now on to the video. If you don't prepare your yarn properly, it's not going to take the dye properly. The dye wouldn't take up in the yarn. Some of it would still be white, or if I tried dyeing solid color yarn. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've observed and some of the things that I know. I started dyeing yarn. I started with a 4-ply merino sock yarn. This is the most difficult yarn to learn to dye with. Just doesn't take the dye that easily, and if you watch other videos and read tutorials, it will tell you to soak the yarn for half an hour. My goal when I started dyeing was to dye solid yarn. I just wanted to dye one color. It's much easier to put your white yarn, any yarn, in a pan and pour a color on top and say, hey, I got this variegated colorway. I can't really tell if there's anything wrong with it. And you know, there really isn't anything wrong with it. It's all about like what you're going for with your style. But if your goal is to dye a solid color and you want the colors to penetrate the yarn completely, then you do need to prep your yarn properly. And using a 4-ply yarn at the beginning when you're learning, a twisted one or like a highly twisted fine yarn, very dense yarn like merino wool, you're gonna need to, first of all, soak this yarn for much longer. Sometimes I'm not picky. Sometimes if I'm making a colorway, sometimes if I'm making a pastel color, I'm not going to do that. But if I want to dye dark colors and I want to dye black, I want to soak a highly dense fine yarn with twists in it. Depends on the yarn type. Anything with nylon in it is going to need a longer soak. That nylon doesn't seem to hold water so quickly. With any added fibers, may need to be soaked longer. All the water can get through to the yarn so that when we're ready to dye it and we pour the dye on, the dye is going to absorb into the yarn all the way through the fibers. If there's any dry bits or semi-dry bits, it's just not going to go in that area, left with little white bits that you may not desire depending on the look you're going for. Dyeing yarn colorways, you really don't need to be that picky, but if you're dyeing solid yarns and you want to achieve solid tones, then you do want to soak your yarn properly. So you don't want to prep that. And the very first thing, we don't want to miss this step, dyeing the right amount for your project. For some reason, I always keep guessing and I never actually prepare the right amount. And so yeah, it's expensive. I just haven't reconciled with the cost of knitting up a sweater for myself. But you got to think buying such a luxury sweater is going to cost a lot more. That's probably what it is. Mostly is the fear of dyeing the yarn that I need, the amount, and then it going wrong. I stick to the same needle size. So I know that if I find a pattern with that needle size, I can guesstimate the amount of yarn I need for my own sweater, for a size small sweater, which is about 400 grams with a 12-ply mohair yarn. You want to get used to meterages when you're preparing your yarn for dyeing for a knitting project. Look at the meterage on your pattern and then look at the meterage of the yarn that you're buying. Get enough yarn for your project and dye it. That's it. Plan the project, slow down, take my time, realize this is a valuable item. It's not something you just whip in a pan, in a pot, and you just dye it, whatever, willy-nilly, and then you just knit it up. Like, this is gonna be a beautiful sweater. Make sure you have enough yarn for your knitting project. I need 800 meters to knit a sweater. I have written down the meterage required for everything I make. I make bags, hats, sweaters. I was doing vests. 800 meters for a small sweater. 400 meters for a bag, like maybe 200 for like the type of hats I make. I'm going to prepare my yarn the previous day, so it's just going to end up soaking for 24 hours anyway, and then I'll be very confident that the yarn, there's not going to be a problem in that area, and I know I can rule that out if anything else goes wrong in the dye process. The yarns that I buy are already cleaned. I haven't had a problem with the dye going into the yarn. I have some mohair from a farm with some oil in it, and that definitely needs to be cleaned like 4 times over. It needs to be rinsed and washed and cleaned, and maybe even another time. And so some yarns, some fibers, especially if you're getting them from a farm or right off who knows where, you need to clean out the oils of them so the yarn will adhere to the fiber. So yeah, clean your yarns if they need to be cleaned, and if they don't, they don't. I have some 4-ply Australian wool yarn, so it's just another situation where it's the type of yarn and it just soaks up really well. You can get a yarn spinner specifically for yarn where it just takes all the water out, and then you have some damp yarn, and you want the yarn to be damp. That is the best way. So you're going to pour your dye onto the damp yarn, or you're going to put your damp yarn into the pot, and then all that dye is going to absorb into the damp yarn. If you put soaking wet yarn into your pot, then the dye may refuse because of the water that's already in the yarn. Hang your yarn so that all the water comes out. That's what I do. I hang my yarn. I used to kind of whip it around in the yard, but now I just hang it. I wait till it all drains and then it's ready. And then I put it in the pot, and you can just see all that color go up into the yarn, and it's so wonderful. But for this one particular yarn, I was just putting the soaking wet yarn right into my little cupcake trays for my samples, and they were just taking it up. No problem at all. Something I never knew when I started dyeing, I wondered why the color was not going evenly. And that is another reason why the color may not be even on your yarn, is because you didn't drain it. And if it's not drained and it just kind of moves around the yarn, not going into the yarn because there's already substance inside it. The next thing for preparing your yarn, you're going to dip 800 grams of yarn in a pot. Pretend you go into a swimming pool and you're going to swim around in it. That's how much room the yarn needs. It just needs a lot of space, quite a bit of space. And also, you don't want a wide pot, you want a tall pot. You do not want fiber to touch the sides of your pot, and you don't want the fiber to touch the bottom of your pot where the heating element is. I left it in the pot. I went to go do something else for 5 minutes. My sweater had touched the bottom of the pot. That's where all the heat is, maybe even burned it a little bit. They can occur as well on the sides of a pot, and so you want your pot wide enough, but tall enough. And you want to raise your temperature up very slowly. You want to not really leave your pot. You want to come back to it. You want to stir it every 5 minutes or so, even if stirring just means a little turn. You don't want to agitate the fibers. If you're dyeing colorways, you can lay out your fiber and you can hand paint the yarn, wrap it up, and put it in the oven, and that's a really nice way to dye yarn. Another way is you can use pan and dye your yarn, pour your dye colors in low immersion, and that's another way where you won't have as many problems. However, I do have problems. My pans burn and they warp, and so I'm looking into getting some sort of cast iron or stainless steel plate I can put on top to disperse the heat more evenly, and then I'm going to put my pan on top. You just don't want to burn your yarn at any time. The best way to dye yarn, in my opinion, is the crock pot. It's low heat, it's low heat. If you're dyeing solid colors, crock pots work pretty good. They're not very big, so you can only fit so much yarn in one crock pot, but it's a wonderful slow, low heat that will never burn your yarn. You want to tie up your yarn in 2 or 4 spots. I only tie my yarn in 2 spots for mohair yarn. Really tangle that easily, but for yarns, fine yarns, you're going to want to tie it in 4 spots. There's 3 ties in this one, so that's good enough. That's what we use. I began using this yarn and realized, like, I struggled with dyeing. I couldn't do it. I couldn't figure it out. All these little things stopped me from yarn dyeing for too long until I met this yarn. And I began dyeing with a mohair yarn, and it took up the dye. I didn't have any blotches. I didn't have any problems with it. I stopped dyeing because I didn't prepare my yarn properly and realized, okay, well, this is just a soaking problem. I just need to soak it longer. I learned somewhere that you needed to drain the water out of your yarn, and that also helped. That also helped me take the dye up easier, especially in the 4-ply merino fine yarn. That was all important stuff. I'm gonna soak all this yarn. And this, 2 of those, 800 meters, going to make a sweater. And this, I'm going to use this bucket to soak my yarn. All right, put it in so that it doesn't get tangled in the first place. So I'm going to put my merino at the bottom. Then we'll put the silk. Still going. So we have that bucket, and we're going to put this in the bucket. I use this acrylic yarn. It's very strong. I just use that to tie my yarn. It's so strong it's never broke before, and I've had 800 grams in the pot, in a really big pot, with this, and I just pull it out. It doesn't break. So I'm going to cut like a pretty big piece. It needs to be quite large so that that yarn moves around. And I just tie it in a knot. You might want to tie it the professional way. Piece. And I split the yarn. This mohair can be a little bit sticky, but what you do is you split the yarn, you grab your string, and you just wrap it around the other side. You grab it, right? So it forms like around that side, and then it's also around that side. And it's an 8 now, like this. And then here, you just tie it. But I'm going to leave lots of room. I'm going to tie it at the end, there, so that there's a lot of room. And that's how you tie the 8. And I'm going to do it for this one, but I've had no luck with the mohair. It does tangle, but I think for most yarns, it's probably fine to do it that way. It's not ideal, but we're going to use that. Tear that. Tear that. Yep, there we go. And just shove that in like that. Okay, so it's 150 grams, which is good, which is fine. Okay, 150, so now we have 250 in there. And I have this little piece here. Let's see what that is. I think it's 25. Oh, it's actually 50 as well, so that's good. So that means we now have 300 grams in there. I'm really scrounging here. I've just run out of my mohair. I just put another order in, but I've run out, and so this is my last mohair. So I'm really scrounging for the last mohair, so that I can, like, I was actually gonna knit a white sweater with it, but you know what? For this video, we'll dye it first and then we'll knit with it. It's always fun. I'm just gonna skein it up. 400 grams. Now I can make a sweater. Very exciting. All in there. So I have a few ideas. I'm going to dye some different types of yarn. I'm going to make a sweater with this and one of those. I am going to, this is for the next video in this series. I'm going to dye this, it's October, so I'm going to make this Halloween colorway. So I'm going to dye that. I'm going to show you the calculations for this colorway, the colors and then the calculations. The next video is all about the dye amounts that you need, measuring your dye, making your solutions, and then measuring the right amount of dye for the fiber. So it's easy when you're just dyeing 100 grams. When you're dyeing, say, 400 grams, that's easy. I just multiply the amount that I need times 4. But when you want to convert that amount to a funny amount, like 24 grams or 36 grams, then you need to work with percentages. If you want to dye small amounts of fiber, like embroidery threads, then you need to change up the whole thing altogether. You need to dilute your dye solutions so that you can measure out tiny amounts. And so I'm going to also show you that. I wasted so much fiber and I kind of stopped experimenting with it because I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out how to dye it without it felting. But once I found out how to do it without it felting, I was done. I stopped and said, okay, I'm not going to dye it now, but now I know. And so I'm going to dye it later. And so this is the day. I'm going to get out a piece of roving and show you guys how to dye that. And another fun thing to do would be to find some sort of already made knitwear. So you could do this with socks or sweaters that you find at an op shop, as long as they're light colored or white. And you can dye that as well. You don't just need to dye yarn. You can dye kind of anything that's made out of wool or silk, or if you're using cotton dyes, cotton. Let's see. This is really thick. It's a scarf. It's super thick. It's not even done, so we'll have to think about whether or not we're going to actually dye that one. I'll finish it, and then I'll finish it tonight and then soak it. That can go in. It's already got the thing off, so we can just soak it. We'll see. Not sure what else I have that's not. That is a different fiber. Non-finished scarf. Another one ready to go. Okay, I'm not sure which one I'm gonna do. Actually, I might end up taking that one apart and making something else. Gosh, we have to weigh all this stuff to know how much. So now I have found the one with the mulberry silk in it, which is exciting. And I found a smaller bag of mohair, so we'll do that, but we're gonna weigh it first. Wondering if this bag is nylon, if it will also take up the dye, and so I could weigh it with the bag. I don't know what they're made of, but they completely take up the natural dyes. I've dyed so many of these bags. You should be adding warm water, but if you're in a situation like I am, that's fine. We're just going to do it cold, and I might bring the buckets into the house and add some warm water. I like to press. You should not squeeze your roving. Do not want to agitate that roving at all. Even with water sprinkled on it, I mean, that stuff just felts. It just felts naturally, like it's not fun stuff. And then we'll do this one. That's fun. Fill that one up with water. I like to have a towel on hand to dry my hands. Put that there. Now we have all our fiber. Some of it has soaked through. This one hasn't taken up pretty much any water since it's been soaked. It's still fluffy. It's wet on the outside, but that needs a fairly long soaking time. Usually what I do with this one is I put it in and I kind of squeeze it till all the bubbles are out. And then I release it slowly and keep it underwater and let the water soak into it. It's already taken up the water a lot better. A fine mohair yarn, because that's it, really. It's taken up the water very easily. I'm still gonna leave it for half an hour because there's nylon in this yarn, and the nylon requires a longer time, at least half an hour, to take up the water. So the dense parts usually are a little bit more oily as well. Even though I've washed this 4 times, it still needs a long time to take up the water. There's this unknown yarn inside here, which I think has silk in it, and it's highly dense. Silks I find soaks up easily, but because this one's twisted, whatever it is, I don't know what it is. I think it's going to take longer than half an hour. I would soak that for 24 hours. We'll see. I probably will end up soaking all of this for 24 hours. I could plunge that one right at the bottom so that it stays like submerged. So that concludes the end of the yarn prep. I'm going to measure the amount of dye I need for the color I want to achieve for each different yarn weight that's here. And I'm going to show you how to do that in the next video. Thank you for watching Muffs Merino.